Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and it will be my pleasure to divide my time tonight with my good friend and colleague, the honourable member from Louis Saint Laurent. Tonight we appear to be the Central Canadian connection here in a debate that many Canadians believe is exclusive to Alberta and British Columbia, Mr. Speaker. But I'm here tonight as a proud Ontario MP that's had the honour of serving and working across this country to say debates like this are critical to the future of our country, and the national interest reflected by pipelines, Mr. Speaker, is as much in the national interest of my constituents in Ontario as it is in Lakeland or Peace River, Mr. Speaker, or in British Columbia or in Louis Saint Laurent. I would remind people in my riding all the time when we were looking at regulatory reviews like the Line 9 reversal and other things accomplished under the government of Stephen Harper. This government has to bend over backwards to hide the fact that many pipeline projects were approved under the previous government. All were reviewed appropriately, but the last government recognized and was proud to stand in this House and proud to stand on any street corner in the country and say that resource development is in Canada's national interest, Mr. Speaker. This Liberal government will not do that. But here you have a Conservative caucus from across this country, and my time representing Durham and my friend from Louis Saint Laurent will remind people that the jobs in Ontario are due to the success and wealth of Canada as a resource country. And getting our products to market through pipelines allows us the best world price, the best royalties, the best economic activity possible, Mr. Speaker. We need to remind Ontarians of that. I'm proud my dad worked for General Motors when I was a kid, and Ontario is still known for vehicle manufacturing, auto parts. Mr. Speaker, in the last decade, there have been more jobs created in Ontario as a result of the resource economy in Alberta than through automobile assembly, Mr. Speaker. When I tell that to auto workers in my area or retired GM workers, they're astounded because they don't hear that enough. And as parliamentarians, it's our duty to remind Canadians that when we say something is in the national interest, it is in their interest at their kitchen table in Southern Ontario just as much as it is around a very concerned kitchen table in Edmonton, Mr. Speaker, or in Calgary. These debates are important, and what troubles me to no end about this government and a Minister of Natural Resources who was heckling my colleague from Peace Country when he was talking about the personal stories. A minister from Edmonton is laughing now, Mr. Speaker. I think we're here to tell those stories, to talk about the concern. I've spoken to the Edmonton Chamber through you, Mr. Speaker, to that minister. They are worried. Canada is not open for business under this Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker. We're closed for business. There is capital fleeing Canada, not because we're the safest and most prosperous and most well-educated and well-trained country in the world. It's because of the uncertainty caused by this Prime Minister. From day one, Mr. Speaker, his first trip abroad to sell Canada at Davos, Mr. Speaker, his quote was, "We're not just resources now, we're resourceful." He mocked the entire resource industry by suggesting that. Maybe the Prime Minister should learn a bit about steam-assisted gravity drainage, or about slant drilling, about shale deposit exploration and extraction, Mr. Speaker, about minimizing water usage in the resource industry in Alberta. The innovation in our resource economy has been astounding, Mr. Speaker. Yet in his first trip to Davos, the Prime Minister just wiped it away. We're resourceful now. We don't need resources. Well, certainly their plan for pipelines means we're not going to sell our resources. And let me tell you, Mr. Speaker, how much the Liberal Party has changed. My friend from Skeena-Bulkley Valley has raised the issue that the Prime Minister got elected by pretending to be a New Democrat when he was in British Columbia, and then pretending to be a Liberal when he was in Ontario or Quebec. And now it's coming home to roost, Mr. Speaker. He has to pick a side. He has to actually defend Trans Mountain as being in our national interest, which it is, Mr. Speaker. And the BC Premier has no mandate. He lost the last election in popular vote and seat count. He is being held hostage by a couple of radical Green MLAs to actually cause a constitutional crisis. That's what he's allowing to happen. It's terrible, and we've heard virtual silence from the Prime Minister of Canada. Let's see how much the Liberal Party has changed. One of the most raucous debates in this chamber took place in May 1956, when the Right Honourable C.D. Howe stood up and said this about pipelines, Mr. Speaker. Quote, "The building of the Trans-Canada Pipeline is a great national project, comparable in importance and magnitude to the building of the St. Lawrence Seaway." He went on to say, "The action proposed today is another declaration of the independence of Canada." That's when they were rushing through a pipeline debate, Mr. Speaker. This Prime Minister has been avoiding selling pipelines and resources to Canadians and around the world, Mr. Speaker. This Prime Minister has waited for a constitutional crisis before he has meetings, before he starts speaking about it being in the national interest. And why is it a crisis? Because he's already dropped the ball, Madam Speaker. A few years ago, former Liberal Premier Frank McKenna said this about Energy East, I quote, "The Energy East project represents one of those rare opportunities to bring all provinces and regions of the country together to support a project that will benefit us all and that is truly in the national interest." End quote. Well, certainly that aspirational national interest language by a prominent former Liberal politician was quashed when the actions of this government led TransCanada to cancel the Energy East pipeline. Previous to that, this Prime Minister had already cancelled the Northern Gateway pipeline, Mr. Speaker, that had been, Madam Speaker, that had been reviewed. What did some Canadians say about that? Chief Elmer Derrick, Chief Dale Swampy, and Elmer Ghostkeeper, three First Nation leaders, said they were very disappointed, Madam Speaker, from the unilateral cancellation of Northern Gateway, a $2 billion opportunity for First Nations in British Columbia cancelled because of a unilateral anti-resource decision by this Prime Minister. We now have Bill C-69. We have a track record in 2.5 years of saying, not just to the global capital markets that Canada's closed, Madam Speaker, we've had members of the Prime Minister's own caucus at one point say, and the Prime Minister say, we need to prepare for closing down our resources, Madam Speaker. We need to move beyond it. And tonight they heckle when they hear about the concern that that causes at a lot of kitchen tables around our country, Madam Speaker. And why I'm so passionate as an Ontario MP. My first job before going to college was inspecting TransCanada pipelines, pipeline inspection crew between Belleville and Ottawa, Madam Speaker. I've seen the economic activity firsthand. I've also seen the manufacturing industry during the global recession when oil prices were still high. Contracts for the oil sands, Madam Speaker, and for exploration in Saskatchewan and Manitoba, that was the lifeline for manufacturing. It kept us afloat. That is the national interest. The fact that we have to bring an emergency debate and the Prime Minister had to have a stopover meeting in between his global jet setting to bring a few premiers together, he's let this crisis happen, Madam Speaker. He's cancelled Northern Gateway, he's cancelled through his actions Energy East, and the one pipeline he thought he could let go, he's letting it slide off the table, with Kinder Morgan now suggesting all of this uncertainty is leading them to question their investment. They're in Hail Mary pass mode, Madam Speaker, when they're trying to suggest they'll buy the line or pay for part of it. That desperation's not needed, Madam Speaker. I would like the Prime Minister for a change to go to Davos and talk about the importance of our resource industry. I would like him to showcase the innovation brought by these men and women that work in our oil patch, in the pipeline industry, and the jobs that supply it, Madam Speaker. It is sad we have to bring an emergency debate to remind the Liberals that jobs in the resource industry from coast to coast are in all Canadians' national interest. Thank you, Madam Speaker.